Hello everyone, I never thought I'd find myself writing something like this, but here I am. Maybe getting it all out will help clear my head. My wife, Laura, and I have been married for 6 years. We met through mutual friends at a dinner party, and it felt like one of those instant connections you hear about but never believe until it happens to you. She was smart, funny, incredibly driven, and had this spark that pulled people in. I was captivated from the start. Our marriage was good, or so I thought. We had our share of ups and downs like any couple, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. Laura worked in marketing, and I had a steady job in finance. We bought a house, traveled when we could, and talked about starting a family soon. It felt like we were building something real, something lasting, but looking back now, I realize the signs were there. They always are. You just don't see them when you're in the middle of it. About 8 months ago, Laura started acting differently. She became distant, less interested in the little routines that used to matter to us. Our Friday movie nights turned into her staying late at work events. She was constantly on her phone, quick to turn the screen away when I was nearby. I told myself she was just stressed, maybe overwhelmed with projects. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? Then there was my job specifically, my boss, Eric. He was charismatic, confident, and the kind of guy who could light up a room. We'd had a good professional relationship, and I even invited him to a couple of gatherings at our home. Laura and Eric hit it off easily, which didn't bother me at the time. I thought it was great that she could get along with my colleagues, but things started to feel off. Laura mentioned Eric more often than seemed normal. Little comments about his sense of humor, his work ethic, how inspiring he was. At first, I brushed it off. But there was this one night, she came home late from a work dinner, claiming it ran over because of a last-minute meeting. Her story was vague, and something about the way she avoided eye contact unsettled me. It wasn't like her to be evasive. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, my suspicions got the better of me. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to snoop, but I did. She left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. My heart raced as I picked it up, debating whether to unlock it. Eventually, curiosity won, and there it was. A thread of messages with Eric. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. When can I see you again? Being with you feels different, exciting. Don't worry about him. He'll never find out. I felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. My chest tightened, my hands shaking as I scrolled through message after message, each one confirming what I couldn't deny anymore. My wife was having an affair. With my boss. She came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, humming like everything was fine. I looked at her, this person I thought I knew better than anyone else, and I felt like I was staring at a stranger. I didn't say anything that night. I couldn't. My mind was a storm of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. I needed time to process before confronting her, to figure out what to do next. The days following my discovery felt like I was trapped in some surreal alternate reality. Everything around me looked the same: our house, her smile, the rhythm of daily life, but it all felt hollow, like I'd stepped into a replica of my own world where nothing was real anymore. I was drowning in my own thoughts, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten here. How she'd gotten here. I replayed every moment in my head. The late nights, the sudden work emergencies, the distant looks she gave me when she thought I wasn't watching. The signs had been there all along, tucked between the lines of our conversations and hidden behind the casual way she'd mention Eric. Eric. Even thinking his name made my stomach knot with a mixture of rage and humiliation. Not only had my wife betrayed me, but she'd done it with my boss, someone I'd trusted, respected, even admired on some level that I knew I couldn't keep pretending. The tension was unbearable, the facade exhausting. So, one evening after dinner, while she was casually scrolling through her phone, I finally broke the silence. I know, Laura. She looked up, confused. Know what? I could feel my pulse in my temples. I wanted to scream, to throw her phone across the room, to demand an explanation that would somehow make sense of this mess. But instead, I stayed calm, too calm. "I know about you and Eric." Her face changed instantly. Gone was the casual indifference. For a split second, there was genuine shock, then it was gone, replaced by something cold, defensive. "What are you talking about?" she scoffed, as if I was the one losing my mind. "I saw the messages, Laura. On your phone." She opened her mouth to respond but then closed it, her eyes darting away like she was scrambling for an excuse. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. It was deflection. "You went through my phone? That's a serious invasion of privacy." I blinked, stunned by the audacity. An invasion of privacy? That was her takeaway? Not the betrayal, not the lies, not the fact that she'd been sneaking around with my boss, but the fact that I'd discovered it. "You're seriously going to stand there and make me the bad guy right now?" My voice was rising despite my effort to stay composed. "You've been cheating on me, Laura. With Eric. My boss. And your first reaction is to guilt me about looking at your phone?" She rolled her eyes, actually rolled her eyes, like this was some petty argument over dishes left in the sink. "Look, it's not what you think," she muttered, crossing her arms like she was the one feeling defensive. "It's complicated." "No, it's really not," I shot back. "You slept with him. That's pretty straightforward." She didn't deny it. Not once. She just sighed dramatically, like I was inconveniencing her with my emotions. "Things have been off between us for a while," she said, her voice flat, like she was reading from a script. "You've been distant. Always working late, always tired. I needed someone who saw me." That hit me like a punch to the chest. Not because it was true, but because of how easily she twisted it. I had been working late, yes, for us. To build the life we talked about. To save for the vacations she wanted, the future we planned. But none of that mattered now. She'd rewritten the narrative to justify her choices, so, instead of talking to me, "You decided to sleep with Eric?" I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. "That was easier?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence said it all, that I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing beside me like nothing had changed. But everything had. The foundation of my life had cracked wide open, and there was no way to put it back together. The next morning, I packed a bag. I didn't tell her where I was going, and she didn't ask. Maybe she thought I'd cool off, that we'd sweep it under the rug like it never happened, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay. Leaving our home felt like walking out of someone else's life. The life I thought was mine had been nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed facade of comfort, trust, and love that had crumbled with a few stolen glances at her phone. I didn't know where I was going when I packed my bag. I just knew I couldn't stay. Every corner of that house felt contaminated with lies, every room echoing with the ghost of a relationship that no longer existed. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city blurring past me as I tried to outrun my own thoughts. Eventually, I found myself in front of my friend Jake's apartment. Jake and I had been close since college, the kind of friendship where you could pick up right where you left off, no matter how much time had passed. I hadn't planned on going there, but my hands seemed to steer the wheel before my brain could catch up. Jake opened the door, and one look at my face was all it took. No questions, no small talk. He just stepped aside and let me in. I collapsed onto his worn-out couch, my mind racing, my heart heavy. The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth as I finally said them out loud. "Laura's been cheating on me. With my boss." Saying it made it real. Until then, it had felt like some horrible dream, a twisted version of my life playing out in my head. But there it was, out in the open, undeniable. Jake didn't respond right away. He just handed me a drink and sat down beside me, his silence saying more than words ever could. Sometimes, you don't need advice or comfort. You just need someone to sit with you in the darkness, acknowledging that it's real. Over the next few days, I tried to piece together what had happened, not just the affair, but everything leading up to it. I replayed conversations, scrutinized her excuses, analyzed her behavior with a magnifying glass that hindsight provided. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs I'd been too blind to follow. Late nights at the office, unexplained absences, the sudden interest in her appearance when she'd claimed she was just meeting colleagues. The betrayal wasn't just about the physical act. It was the emotional manipulation, the casual lies slipped into everyday conversations, the way she'd looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the affair itself, but the realization that the person I trusted most had been capable of such deception. Eventually, Laura reached out. A simple text, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. What was there to say? What could she possibly explain that would make any of this better? But a part of me needed to hear it to confront the mess head-on instead of letting it fester in my mind. So, I agreed to meet her. We chose a neutral place, a small cafe downtown where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. When I walked in, she was already there, looking composed, like this was just another routine conversation. She smiled slightly when she saw me, as if we were old friends catching up instead of estranged spouses and navigating the wreckage of our marriage. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding but my face calm. She started with the usual, "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. It just happened." As if falling into bed with my boss was an accidental slip, like forgetting to lock the front door or spilling coffee on your shirt. I listened, not because I cared about her excuses, but because I wanted to see if she'd take responsibility. She didn't. She danced around the truth, painting herself as the victim of her own poor decisions, blaming stress, our growing distance, her dissatisfaction with life. She even tried to justify it by claiming Eric understood her in ways I apparently never could. When she finally stopped talking, I said nothing for a long moment. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't recognize the person sitting across from me. She wasn't the woman I married. Maybe she never was. I stood up, left some money on the table, and said the only thing that felt true: "You made your choice. And now I'm making mine." I walked out without looking back. Walking out of that cafe felt like shedding a skin I'd been trapped in for years. There was no dramatic goodbye, no parting words dripping with bitterness or regret. Just a simple sentence that closed the chapter one never imagined I'd be forced to write: "You made your choice. And now I'm making mine." The moment the door shut behind me, the noise of the bustling street outside swallowed everything. People moved around me, laughing, rushing, living as if the ground beneath my feet hadn't just shifted. That's the cruel thing about heartbreak. The world keeps spinning, indifferent to the fact that yours has stopped. I didn't go back to Jake's apartment right away. I walked aimlessly, letting the cool evening air bite at my face, hoping it would numb more than just my skin. My thoughts were loud, too loud, looping in an endless cycle of, how did I miss this? Was I not enough? Did any of it mean anything to her? But somewhere between the anger and the sadness, a strange clarity began to take root. It wasn't about me. Her betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, my efforts, or my love. It was a reflection of her choices, her lack of integrity, her inability to confront her own dissatisfaction without dragging me into the wreckage. The next few days were a blur of logistics, figuring out where to stay, what to do with our shared accounts, and how to untangle two lives that had been woven together for 6 years. I contacted a lawyer, not because I was ready to dive into divorce proceedings just yet, but because I needed to know my options. Knowledge felt like the only control I had left. Laura texted me a few times, her tone swinging like a pendulum between remorse and defiance. "I miss you. I made a mistake. You're overreacting. We can work through this. You're being selfish for walking away without even trying to fix it." Selfish. That word echoed louder than the rest. As if enduring her betrayal quietly would have been the selfless thing to do. I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to punish her, but because there was nothing left to say. Words couldn't fix what had been broken, not when the break was caused by months of deceit, not just a single moment of weakness. One night, as I sat alone in the small apartment I'd rented temporarily, surrounded by the bare essentials of my new life, I felt the weight of it all collapse on me. The anger, the sadness, the humiliation, it came crashing down in waves. I didn't try to fight it. I let it drown me for a while because pretending to be okay felt more exhausting than facing the truth that I wasn't okay, that I was shattered, but acknowledging that was the first real step toward healing. Eventually, the tears stopped. The ache dulled. And in that quiet aftermath, I felt something unexpected: relief, not because I was happy about what had happened, but because I was free. Free from the lies, the gaslighting, the invisible weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for months. I wasn't living in the shadow of her choices anymore. I was standing on my own, raw and broken, but real. The next morning, I woke up early and did something simple. I went for a run. It wasn't far, and it wasn't fast, but with every step, I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of myself. The parts she'd chipped away with every lie, every excuse, every moment of indifference. It was just me, the pavement, and the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, proof that I was still here, still standing. Rebuilding after betrayal isn't like flipping a switch or crossing some imaginary finish line. It's a slow, messy process: one step forward, two steps back. Some days, you wake up feeling like you've conquered the worst of it. Other days, it creeps up on you out of nowhere: a song on the radio, a familiar scent, an unexpected email, and suddenly, you're back in that dark place, wondering if you've made any progress at all. That's how it was for me after that night in the temporary apartment. After the flood of emotions and the fragile sense of relief, I thought maybe I'd turned a corner. I started establishing routines: morning runs to clear my head, long walks to nowhere in particular, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, just existing. It was mundane, but there was comfort in the simplicity. No more hidden texts to wonder about, no more forced smiles at dinner, no more pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. That I started seeing a therapist. Jake suggested it, and at first, I brushed it off because I thought I could handle it on my own. But the truth was I couldn't. The sessions were hard, especially the first few. Sitting there, spilling my guts to a stranger, felt unnatural. But slowly, it helped. I began to understand that healing wasn't just about getting over what happened, it was about reclaiming control over my own narrative. Laura tried reaching out again. Her messages shifted from guilt to nostalgia, as if reminding me of our good times could somehow erase the betrayal. I miss the way we used to laugh together. Do you ever think about how happy we were before things got complicated? We can still fix this if you just talk to me. I didn't respond, not because I was angry though. Some part of me still was, but because I realized that answering her would only reopen wounds that were finally starting to scab over. She wasn't reaching out because she wanted to make things right, she was reaching out because she missed the comfort I provided. One day, while going through some old boxes I'd left unpacked, I found a photo album from our early years: vacations, holidays, random snapshots of us laughing at nothing in particular. I expected it to hurt, but instead, I felt disconnected. Like looking at strangers who happened to share my face. That's when it hit me: I wasn't grieving Laura anymore. I was grieving the version of her I thought was real. The life we built wasn't all a lie, but it wasn't the truth I thought it was, either. And that realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. I focused on small victories after that. Finishing a book without losing focus, cooking a meal without feeling the weight of silence in an empty apartment, laughing at a joke without it feeling forced. Each moment was a brick in the foundation of my new life. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd drifted from during the years I'd been wrapped up in my marriage. Funny how isolation creeps in so subtly. You don't even notice it until you're standing in the wreckage, realizing you'd built walls where bridges should have been. Conversations with them were refreshing. No pity, no awkward silences, just genuine connections. It reminded me of who I was before my identity got tangled up with being someone's husband, and somewhere along the way, I stopped counting the days since she broke my heart. time has a strange way of softening the sharp edges of pain. It doesn't erase it, not completely, but it dulls the sting, blurs the vividness of the worst memories until they're just faded outlines in the background of your mind. That's how it felt for me. Like I'd been holding my breath for months, and one day, without even realizing it, I finally exhaled. Life settled into a new rhythm. I wasn't waking up with that heavy weight on my chest anymore. The mornings felt lighter, the silence of my apartment less suffocating. I even started enjoying the quiet, finding comfort in the absence of tension, the kind of tension I hadn't even noticed had existed in my marriage until it was gone. Therapy helped more than I expected. My therapist asked me one day, "When was the last time you felt like yourself?" That question hit harder than I thought it would. I realized I'd spent so much time trying to be the perfect husband, the dependable employee, the guy who had it all together, that I'd lost sight of who I actually was beneath all that. It wasn't just Laura I'd lost parts of myself, too. So, I started finding those parts again. That I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, things I used to love but had set aside for the sake of grown-up responsibilities. I bought a cheap guitar off a local classifieds page and spent hours fumbling through chords, not because I was any good at it, but because it made me feel alive. I signed up for a weekend hiking group, even though I wasn't much of an outdoors person. It didn't matter. The point was to do things for me, not for anyone else. And then there were the unexpected moments. The little reminders that healing isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it's as simple as walking past the coffee shop where we used to go without feeling that familiar pang of nostalgia. Or hearing a song we both liked and not immediately skipping it because it hurt too much. One day, I ran into Eric. Yeah, him. It wasn't planned. I was grabbing lunch downtown, and there he was, sitting outside a cafe, laughing with someone like he didn't have a care in the world. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I just felt nothing. And that's when I knew I'd won. Not in the petty, vindictive way I used to imagine, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that he no longer had any power over me. He saw me. Our eyes met for a brief second. He gave me a nod, one of those half-hearted, awkward acknowledgments, like he wasn't sure if I'd punch him or ignore him. I chose the latter. I kept walking, not because I was avoiding confrontation, but because he wasn't worth my time or energy. Later that night, I thought about that encounter. A version of me, the guy from months ago, would have played out all the things I could have said, the clever comebacks, the moral high ground speeches. But the man I was now didn't need any of that. Walking away was louder than anything I could have said. Laura texted again, weeks after our last failed attempt at closure. This time, it was different. "I'm sorry. For everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say it anyway." I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I was tempted to reply, I wasn't, but because I realized I'd been waiting for those words without even knowing it. Not for reconciliation, not for some dramatic ending. Just for acknowledgement that I didn't respond. Not because I was bitter, but because I didn't need to. Forgiveness isn't always about letting the other person off the hook. Sometimes, it's about freeing yourself from the weight of resentment. And that's exactly what I did. I forgave her. Silently. Privately. Not for her, but for me, because I deserved peace. Starting over sounds like this: neat, clean break, pack your things, change your routine, move on. But the reality? It's messy. Healing doesn't follow a straight path. It's more like walking through a forest with no map, where sometimes you think you found the way out, only to hit another dead end. But somewhere along that winding path, I realized something important. I wasn't lost anymore. Life had settled into a rhythm, one that wasn't defined by the echoes of my past. Mornings felt different, lighter. I'd wake up, not with the heaviness of betrayal, but with quiet gratitude. Gratitude for simple things: my morning coffee, the warmth of sunlight pouring through the window, the quiet hum of a city that had moved on even when I thought my world had stopped. That I'd started seeing someone new, not in the way people rush into relationships to fill a void, but naturally. Her name was Claire. We met at one of those random community events Jake dragged me to. She was different, no pretense, no games, just genuine. Our first conversation wasn't some cinematic, fate-driven moment. It was about bad coffee, of all things. But it was easy, comfortable in a way that didn't feel forced. That I didn't tell her about my past right away. Not because I was hiding it, but because it wasn't the headline of my story anymore. When I did open up, she listened, not with pity, but with understanding. There was no judgment, no awkwardness. Just two people, both with their own scars, finding something new in each other. But even with Claire, I learned that healing isn't about replacing old memories with new ones. There were moments when doubt crept in, those quiet fears that whispered, "What if it happens again?" But I realized that wasn't about her. It was about me, about trusting myself enough to know that I'd be okay, no matter what. One evening, we sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She asked me, "Do you ever miss her?" I thought about it, not to search for the right answer, but to be honest. "No," I said after a pause. "I don't miss her. I miss who I thought she was." And that was the truth. I wasn't holding on to Laura anymore. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't grieving. She was just a chapter one that taught me more about myself than any good times ever could. Later that week, I received an unexpected email from Eric. Short, formal, almost clinical. "I just wanted to reach out and apologize for everything that happened. I handled things poorly, and I regret how it affected you. I hope you're doing well." Reading it, I didn't feel the surge of rage I thought I would. No satisfaction, no closure, just indifference. I didn't reply. He didn't deserve my time or energy, because the truth is, closure doesn't come from apologies. It comes from acceptance. Accepting that people will hurt you, that not every story has a neat ending, and that sometimes, the person you have to forgive the most is yourself for staying too long, for ignoring the signs, for believing in something that wasn't real. But that's okay. Because growth often comes from the most painful places. These days, I don't measure my progress by how much I've forgotten about the past. I measure it by how fully I'm living in the present. And in this present moment, I'm okay. Actually, I'm more than okay. I'm happy. There's a moment in healing where you realize you've crossed an invisible threshold. It's not marked by a grand revelation or a dramatic change. It's subtle, almost like waking up one day and noticing the air feels lighter, the weight you've been carrying somehow gone without you realizing when it happened. That's how it felt for me. It wasn't that I forgot about Laura or the betrayal. It's that it stopped defining me. My story wasn't about what she did anymore. It was about what I did after. My life had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt peaceful. Not the forced kind of peace where you pretend everything's fine, but genuine, soul-deep peace. I'd found joy in the small things again: morning runs that cleared my mind, late-night conversations with friends who reminded me of who I was before all this, and moments of solitude that didn't feel lonely anymore. Claire and I continued to grow closer. There was something effortless about being with her, not because she was perfect or because she fixed me, but because she didn't expect me to be anything other than myself. And for the first time in a long time, I liked who that was. But healing isn't linear. There were still days when the past crept in like shadows at dusk, subtle but there. One of those days hit me unexpectedly. I was cleaning out the last box of stuff I'd kept from my old life. Things I'd shoved in a corner, too busy or maybe too scared to deal with. Inside, I found a letter Laura had written me years ago, back when things were good. It was filled with promises, declarations of love, dreams for the future we never had. I sat there, holding it, expecting the familiar ache to return. But instead, I felt nothing. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this was part of my story, but not the story. She was a chapter, not the book. I threw the letter away without a second thought. That night, I told Claire about it. She listened, not trying to fix it or offer advice, just there. And that's when I realized how far I'd come. I didn't need validation. I didn't need someone to tell me I was okay. I already knew. A few weeks later, I got another email, this time from Laura. The subject line was simple: I'm getting married. I stared at it, not out of curiosity, but because it felt like the final thread connecting us had just been cut. I opened it, read the short message filled with polite, formal words, and closed it without replying. No anger. No sadness. Just closure, not because she was moving on, but because I already had. I realized that true healing isn't about forgetting the people who hurt you. It's about remembering them without pain. Without resentment. Without letting them take up space in your heart where growth could be. These days, my heart feels full, not with revenge, not with regret, but with life. The kind I built from the rubble of what was once broken. And that's the thing about heartbreak: it doesn't just break you. It shapes you. And sometimes, it shapes you into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient than you ever thought you could be. It's strange how life unfolds after heartbreak. You expect the pain to linger forever, like a scar that never quite fades. But what no one tells you is that the pain doesn't stay sharp. It softens, shifts, and eventually becomes part of your story, not the headline, just a footnote in the chapters you write afterward. I never thought I'd reach this point. A place where I could look back at everything that happened with clarity, not bitterness. Where Laura's betrayal wasn't the center of my universe, just something that happened to me, like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. It's there if I choose to look, but I don't need to anymore. Claire and I had grown into something solid, real, without the fragile facade I'd unknowingly built my marriage on. She didn't try to fix me, and I never expected her to. That was the difference. I'd learned that healing isn't about finding someone new to fill the spaces someone else left empty. It's about realizing those spaces were never meant to be filled by someone else in the first place. One weekend, we decided to take a spontaneous road trip, a small town a few hours away, the kind of place where life slows down. As we drove with the windows down, music playing softly, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pure, unfiltered joy. No background noise of doubt or fear. Just the simple contentment of being exactly where I was, with no need to be anywhere else. That night, sitting under a sky full of stars, Claire asked me, "Do you think you're over it?" Over her? I didn't have to think about it. I'm not just over her, I said. I'm over the version of me who thought I needed her to be happy. And it was true. That version of me, the one who stayed despite the red flags, who thought love was about endurance instead of reciprocity, that version was gone. In his place was someone who'd been broken, yes, but who'd also been rebuilt stronger. Not in spite of the pain, but because of it. The real shift came when I stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and started asking, "What did I learn from it?" And I learned a lot. I learned that people will disappoint you, but that doesn't mean you should stop trusting. It just means you should start trusting yourself more. I learned that love isn't supposed to feel like walking on eggshells, constantly questioning your worth. I learned that endings aren't failures. Sometimes, they're just necessary transitions to something better. A few months later, out of nowhere, I got an invitation to Laura's wedding. Not from her directly, but through a mutual friend who thought I might want closure. The old me would have obsessed over it, what it meant, how I felt about it, whether I should respond, but the new me? I laughed, not out of malice, not because I wanted to mock her happiness, but because it was so irrelevant to my life now. I didn't need closure from a ceremony I wasn't part of. I already had closure. I'd built it for myself. I didn't RSVP. I didn't send a message. I didn't even think about it after that day, because here's the thing about closure: it's not something someone else gives you. It's something you create when you realize you're no longer holding on. And I wasn't. My life was full, not because I'd replaced what I'd lost, but because I'd discovered what was always there. Me. I'd built a life I loved, surrounded by people who saw me for who I really was, not who I tried to be. I woke up every day with a sense of purpose, not because everything was perfect, but because I'd learned to find meaning in the imperfections. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone going through heartbreak, it's this: you will survive. But more than that, you will thrive. Not immediately. Not without pain. But eventually. You'll wake up one day and realize that the person who broke you doesn't get to define you. That the love you lost wasn't the only love you'll ever know. That the life you thought was over is just beginning, and that's where I am now, not at the end of my story, but at the start of a new chapter. One I'm writing for myself. No apologies. No regrets, just me, and that's enough. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet spaces where you finally feel settled. That's where I found myself, months after ignoring Laura's wedding invitation, living a life I never thought possible when everything first fell apart. It was a regular Tuesday, nothing special about it. I was walking home from work, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that makes you pause even when you've seen 100 like it before. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down, expecting a message from Claire or Jake, but instead, it was Laura. A simple text. I know it's been a while. Can we talk? For a second, my heart hesitated, not because of lingering feelings, but because of the memory of who I used to be when her name lit up my screen. That version of me would have felt a rush of emotions, confusion, anger, curiosity. But standing there on the sidewalk, watching the world move around me, I felt none of that. Just a distant, detached curiosity. I didn't reply right away. I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on my balcony, letting the cool evening air wrap around me like a familiar comfort. Did I owe her a conversation? Maybe not. But part of me wanted to see what she could possibly have to say after all this time. The next day, I texted back, sure. Tomorrow. 5 p.m. Same cafe as last time. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meeting at the same place where I'd first confronted her felt like closing a loop I didn't even realize was still open. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table, staring into a half-empty coffee cup. She looked different. Not just older, but worn out in a way that had nothing to do with age. Life had etched its lessons into her face, just as it had mine. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mix of relief and hesitation. Hey, she said softly, as if we were old friends instead of people with a fractured history. I sat down, leaning back in my chair, waiting. She fumbled with her cup, then finally looked me in the eye. I wanted to apologize. Properly. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. She went on about how she'd been reflecting on everything, how she realized the depth of the damage she'd caused not just to me, but to herself. She mentioned her marriage briefly, glossing over the details, which told me more than her words ever could. She didn't look happy. She looked hollow. I thought I knew what I wanted back then, she said quietly. But I was wrong. And I'm sorry for how I treated you. You didn't deserve that. I nodded slowly, processing her words. Not because they changed anything, but because they were the kind of apology people give when they're seeking redemption for themselves, not the person they hurt. I appreciate you saying that, I finally replied. But I've already forgiven you. A long time ago. She blinked, clearly surprised. Maybe she thought I'd still be holding on to resentment, that I needed her apology to move on. But the truth was, I'd let go long before she realized I had. The conversation didn't last much longer. We parted ways with a polite nod, no dramatic goodbyes, no lingering glances. Just two people who had shared a story that was long over. As I walked away, I felt lighter, not because of her apology, but because it confirmed what I already knew. I was free. Later that evening, I told Claire about the meeting. She listened, her hand resting gently on mine, not out of jealousy or insecurity, but simple curiosity. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. Like it was just another day. And that's when I realized I'd truly healed. Not because I'd met someone new, not because I'd rebuilt my life, but because my past no longer had the power to shape my present. It's funny how life circles back in ways you don't expect. The same streets I used to walk, lost in my thoughts, now felt different, not because they'd changed, but because I had. The air seemed lighter, not burdened by the weight of questions I'd already answered for myself. After that meeting with Laura, there was no lingering doubt, no emotional hangover. It wasn't some dramatic finale to our story, it was just a quiet, necessary epilogue. And that's the thing about closure, it rarely comes wrapped in some grand moment. It's found in the calm afterward, in the realization that the past holds no more power over you than you allow. Life moved on, as it always does. Claire and I grew closer, not in the rushed, intense way new relationships sometimes burn, but with a steady, comforting warmth. There was no need to fill spaces with forced words or gestures. Just being with her felt like breathing easy, like I didn't have to perform or shrink parts of myself to fit someone else's expectations. One evening, as we sat watching the city lights flicker from our apartment window, she turned to me and asked softly, "Do you ever think about her?" I paused, not because it was a hard question, but because it deserved an honest answer. "Sometimes," I said. "But not in the way I used to. She's part of my story, sure. But that's all she is now, a chapter I've already finished." And that's exactly how it felt. Laura wasn't some ghost lingering in the corners of my mind. She was just the past. A person I once knew, whose actions had shaped a part of my life, but not the whole of it. I'd built something new, something better, not despite what happened, but because of it. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had stripped me down, yes. But it also gave me the chance to rebuild, to create a life that felt more authentic than the one I'd been clinging to. I no longer measured my days in before and after her. My life wasn't divided by that line anymore. It was one continuous journey, with lessons etched into every step. If you'd told me back then, in the thick of it, that I'd ever feel grateful for the heartbreak, I would have laughed, probably bitterly. But now? I am grateful. Not for the betrayal, but for what it taught me, that losing someone can be the beginning of finding yourself, that love isn't about enduring, it's about growing together, yes, but also as individuals, that healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means making peace with it. So, here's what I've learned, and maybe, if you're reading this because you're in the middle of your own heartbreak, it'll help you too. You will be okay, not today, maybe not tomorrow. But one day, you'll wake up, and the pain will feel smaller. You'll smile without forcing it. You'll laugh without that echo of sadness, and you'll realize that the person who hurt you was never the author of your story. You were, and you still are. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something new, something better.